Here today to hear about a new book called The Black and the Blue: A Cop Rebuilds the Crimes, Racism, and Injustice in America Law Enforcement, co-authored by Matthew Horace and Ron Harris, who is here with us today. Ron Harris is an award-winning journalist who has worked for Ebony Magazine, as well as the Los Angeles Times and St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspapers. More recently, he was Director of Communications at Howard University, as well as an adjunct professor of journalism for the school. Released last month, the 238-page book is off to a great start. It has gotten 4 out of 5 stars on Amazon, a strong review from USA Today, and a thumbs up from the Washington Post, where Georgetown University law professor Paul Butler called the book, quote, an important contribution to a growing body of work about minority police officers. So please, everyone, welcome Ron Harris.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. When we started down this road on this book, they called, how it happened is they called me in. The author, or this cop, had been on CNN. And as you recall, we had a spate of black males dying at the hands of police following Michael Brown, and then there was Eric Garner, and there was it's all over Minneapolis, Terrence Crutcher down in Oklahoma City. And they would call him in as a sort of legal analyst or criminal analyst, and he would give his comments. And as he looked at it, he said he wanted to go a little bit further. So they sent a book proposal to a publishing company, Hachette Books, which is, to my surprise, the third largest publishing company in the world. And as they looked at it, they didn't quite like the proposal. They called up a friend of mine who's a longtime editor for Simon & Schuster, and she said, you need this guy named Ron Harris. And so they brought me in, we reworked the proposal, and then we set out to do the book. You know, it's funny, as a journalist, particularly after doing this for so long, you think you know this stuff. And I don't know any black journalist, Sam, I think you will attest to this, that has not covered these issues kind of ad nauseum. I mean, this what everybody thinks is new, with African American men and women being abused by police, is not news. It's been going on forever.
But in the book, Ron, you write that not everybody is cut out to be a police officer. However, police work seems to attract an unusually high number of one particular group in our society, and that's military veterans.
That's true.
While military veterans make up 6% of the population, they account for 19% of police officers. As someone who has covered both combat in Iraq and policing in the United States, what accounts for this attraction, and what kind of impact does it have on police community interactions that you describe in your book?
You know, what accounts for it is they say these are guys who are, the police department seems to think of themselves as paramilitary operations. And so they say, oh yeah, guy, he's got military service, he'll fit right in. It's almost the worst thing you can do. Because what military guys do, when they're out on a mission, and I was embedded, as you talked, I was embedded with Marines during the Iraq War in 2003, and then I went back over in 2004. And what you learn quickly, they're almost like just a pointed gun. You point them in a direction, they go break stuff. The Marines used to say, our motto is, we kill people and break shit. You don't want that person on your police department. That when they have a mission, their mission is to go up in that house, and no matter who it is, arrest them and drag them out. Don't listen, don't have any conversation, don't have any empathy. However, police departments, as you point out, have a tendency to say, oh, they have that training. They're familiar with guns. They have the right attitude. They're familiar with the paramilitary structure, so let's bring those people in. And that really has been a fault in policing.
Well, let's go to the book. Police corruption is a recurring theme in your book. You spend a lot of time in Chicago and Ferguson, Missouri in particular, examining this issue. And I'm sure many members of our audience are familiar with Hollywood's take on police corruption over the years, going back to Al Pacino and Serpico in the 70s, to Treat Williams and Prince of the City in the 1980s, and Richard Gere in Internal Affairs in the 1990s, and Denzel Washington in Training Day in 2001. Why in 2018 do we still have so much police corruption in real life, and how does it manifest itself in the cities you visited?
The reason we have police corruption is because of this thing called the blue line. Most police departments, and I cannot tell you, I can't emphasize this enough, and it's one of the things I really, really came to understand, that once you come into most police departments, you are under this rubric that says whatever happens inside the police department stays inside the police department. We don't tell on our other officers. We keep, even when we see people doing wrong, we don't talk about it. We protect them at all costs. You mentioned the fact that one of the cities we went to, well, let me back up. And what happens, that breeds a culture. And that culture creates crime. I'm going to call it, it's crime. Because let me do the flip side on that on the street. On the street, what's the phrase? Snitches get stitches, right? The same phrase in the police department. It's just the reverse. Snitches get stitches. Snitches get stitches allows crime and criminal behavior to continue. Similar situation. I was working as a reporter actually in St. Louis, Missouri, which is right next door to Illinois, right on the line. And I remember when this Republican governor suddenly stopped all executions. And I'm sitting there saying, why would a Republican governor, the Republican Party is very pro-execution, suddenly stop all executions? I never really understood why until I started working on this book. One guy, one guy, I can't remember his name right now, he was running a lot of crimes. He actually ordered the execution of a black woman because she saw him beating up a guy. And so what he, at one point they had an FBI sting. They said, well, you know, we need some police officers to, we know you're corrupt. We need some police officers to guard our cocaine stash. He said, I can get you some police officers. So he did. He got him 6 police officers. And guess what? They didn't show up in plain clothes. They showed up in their uniforms to protect his cocaine stash. And they said, why would you show up in your, this is an undercover thing, man. Why would you show up in your uniform? We just want you to know we were legit. That does not exist. That does not exist unless there's that blue line. And that's what accounts for all of this over and over and over again. Because officers, to some degree, to a large degree, and I spoke to a lady out of New York, I spoke to officers all over the place. Here's what happens if you don't do it. And if you don't go along, they will not cover your back. And you'll be out there on assignment. Nobody's coming for you. And that happens. And that happens a lot. I'll give you one last story. There was a lady who's a commander in the Chicago Police Department now, very smart woman. She's now moved to Internal Affairs Division. She was a commander of a big unit. And she told me, see, that, you know, in the department, everybody knows what's going on. Everybody knew that this one particular officer took bribes when he made traffic stops. Everybody knew it. Nobody told about it. She said, you know what? I'm not going down behind him. So she told him, she said, look, if you take money, I'm going to tell. Now, they got this strange rule. If you tell this person in advance and they do it, you're okay. But if they do it and you don't tell them that and you tell on them, now you're bad. So she told, but her saying that, she said he never stole in front of me, but he kept stealing.
Help me with. My first encounter with law enforcement was when I was 16 years old, just got my driver's license, and a white police officer stopped me for running a stop sign about 2 miles from here. He was courteous, just gave me a warning, said don't do it again, and I went on my merry way home. 15 years later, I moved to Los Angeles. I got stopped 3 times within 2 months of living there. One time, a black police officer stopped me. It was pitch black night, claimed I looked like some suspect that he couldn't identify. Now, mind you, all 3 of these occasions, there was no probable cause that the officer could articulate to me. You have visited New York, Chicago, New Orleans, a bunch of other cities. What accounts for the disparity in police and community relations in this country?
2 things. One is it comes from the top, and it depends on what community you're living in. in Los Angeles, and the thing is, when Jupe tells these stories, anybody who lived in it, we were there at the same time. I had the exact same thing happen to me all the time. They'd stop you in the middle of the night. Well, you look like a suspect we're looking for. How could I possibly, would you look through the rearview mirror from behind me? Uh, what we found, for instance, in certain cities, I'll give you Arlington is an example, where Carolyn was a police officer, and the guy in the book, he was also a police officer in Arlington. They had a requirement that every police officer had to at least have a associate's degree or a college degree. And that was a big part of the difference in that department. Also, if you looked at in Los Angeles, as you remember when we were there, the chief, Daryl Gates, I mean, he was stone cold racist, and that permeated the department. Those practices permeated the department. One day I asked my youngest son, I had given him a car, and just out of the blue I asked him, I said, do you ever get stopped by the police? He looked at me like I had lost my mind. He's like, do I get stopped by the police 3 times a week? And it is an attitude inside those departments. But the bottom line on that is that it's an attitude that we sort of allow to exist. Until we as a society and a culture hold police accountable, they will continue to do that.
In the book, you and your co-author identify police bias as one of the major factors that affects how law enforcement interacts with people of color in particular. Tell our audience about the humorous and not so humorous police bias examples you cite in the book.
Yeah, one of the things that some things are racism, other things are bias. And they're the biases that we all have about certain things that we develop either from culture, from the books we read, from television shows we see. It's funny, we looked at some research, and it found that Americans have a white bias. All Americans, as a rule. Black people less so than, let's say, Hispanics or Asians, but we have a bias towards things that are white. And that's what the culture has attempted to teach us. So one great example, and because of that bias, things go wrong. And I'll give you an example. A woman calls the police. This is down in Fort Worth, Texas. She calls the police and she says, an officer shows up. And she says, "Sir, I'm calling the police on this man because he hit my son." She said, "Well, why did he hit your son?" And the cop has already talked to this white man. He said, "Well, he claimed that my son threw a piece of paper on his yard, and he hit my son. He doesn't have a right to put his hands on my son." At the end of that conversation, that woman was arrested, and her daughter was arrested after she called the police because this man put his hands on her son. And that's what I mean about bias. She was wrong. That guy was right.
I'm going to ask one more question before we audience questions. Earlier this month, 26-year-old Botham Jean was shot by an off-duty Dallas police officer while he was relaxing in his own apartment. He joined a long list of troubling and sometimes fatal police encounters with black people just going about their daily lives. These encounters have become so numerous they've been assigned the hashtag #LivingWhileBlack. What advice would you have for members of our audience and readers on how to handle a police encounter to reduce the chances of things going wrong?
You know, I wish I had a book. There's a lady in the book. Her name is Amy Hunter. I met her in St. Louis. She tells an incredible story. I went to her house, and she lives in a very upscale neighborhood of St. Louis, a place called University City. And she had when she was younger, she and her husband, they had 10-year-old sons. They were twins. And she said they made it a pact that when they became tall enough, at least her height, which was 5 feet, that they would give them the talk. And that's the thing that many black parents do. And that talk is, when the police stop you, no matter what happens, no matter what they say, you do exactly what they say. Don't argue. Just no matter what they ask you to do, because you can't win that argument on the side of the road. So they gave him that talk. A couple of years later, her son went down to an area in St. Louis called the Del Mar Loop. It's an entertainment area. In fact, God, I can't think of his name right now. The guy who started rock and roll. Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry played at a club down there. In fact, he played down there every week almost until his death in 2017. And so it was a very popular place. So his son went down, and he saw two of his friends. He was meeting some friends, and he saw them drinking. He knew that was a no-no, so he headed back home. On his way home, about 5 houses away from his house, the police stopped him. And they said he looked like a man who was armed with a machete. Now, he's 12 years old, 5 feet tall. But he was unnerved by that, and they let him go, and he came home. And I remember when she told me that story, because that story moved her in such a way. He came home. He was rattled. He said, "Mom, I had on khaki pants. I got on a polo shirt. I got on my Sperry topsiders. I had my shirt tucked into my pants." And she said to me, she said, like the clothes were going to save him. And she said, I knew that they wouldn't save him. He asked her, he said, is it because I'm black? And she said she didn't really want to tell him that you got to carry this. She said, but you could tell, she could see he was confused. And his tears started welling up in his eyes. And then he said, Mom, I just want to know how long this is going to go on. And she turned to him, she told me, she said, now I had tears in my eyes. And she said to him, for the rest of your life.
Anyone have any questions? Please come up to the mic. I know somebody.
We weren't that thorough.
I have a comment to make. I appreciate your talk. I have 4 children. I live in McLean, Virginia. Most people look at me and don't think that I'm quite African American. They wonder, like, what is your race? Well, I have 2 sons. One who is actually 22, who's probably a little bit darker than my complexion, but just slightly. And I have a 18-year-old son who is very dark skinned compared to my complexion. And a comment that I wanted to make is that my light-skinned son probably hasn't encountered too much, at least not verbalized it, in regards to so far his life with the police. But my 18-year-old, when he was 14 years old, he went to his first party, which was a New Year's Eve party in McLean, Virginia. And there was alcohol at the party. Apparently, somebody had called. It was a disgruntled kid who wasn't invited to the party. And the parents called and said that there was alcohol at the party. And so the police arrived at this Caucasian home. And I think my son was one of it as far as African American. And so the police came in and said the party had to be broken up. And so all the kids who had drivers that were picking them up, and my son had gone with a Caucasian friend, and it was a Caucasian parent who had actually picked up my son and her son. And her son made it to the car, and my son was stopped. And he was questioned about, where do you live, son? And he said, I live, gave the address, McLean, Virginia. And they said, no, you don't. And he said, yes, I do. Who are your parents? He said, my parents are 2 doctors. And they said, no, son, you're telling a lie, And finally, the mom who was picking up the son said, what are you doing? And of course, my son was terrified to death. And it was really my first understanding, knowing the media and everything that's going on, but it really hit home that we really need to teach our children about racial profiling. And my son had experienced it at the innocent age of 14, and he was terrified, and I think it's something that's still a part of him to this day. And I guess my question is, although we're raising it to the awareness of our kids, how much do you really tell your children? You tell them, be polite when you're stopped behind a car, particularly on a highway or on a dark street. you put your hands, we're trying to teach them that you keep your hands present, that so that the police can see, because we know that people make impressions as far as police officers. If you move your hand, they think you're going for a gun. It is quite frightening trying to raise our children in today's society, but just within my own family, just looking at color differences, my youngest son has been kind of a product of what's going on in America.
One of the things we did in the book, because I hear what you're saying, but we're never going to win when we're constantly reacting to them. You have to get the police to react to you. And by that, it's funny, I was talking to, because I always hear people say, well, what should we do? I was talking to the former black guy who's the former chief of New York City Police. He said every organization should have a police liaison or police committee or police some relationship with police. And I'm going to give you a quick example. What happens is, what police do, police get their orders from somewhere else. And when I mean that not just within police departments. When you're in a situation like you talked about, that you're in a certain neighborhood and you get stopped by police, they didn't just decide to do that. But our city council people, the mayor, all of those people who really sit on top of the police, then all of these things will continue.
Do we have another question?
Hi, my name's Tadasha Shiver. I want to thank everyone for coming out to this event tonight. We really appreciate you writing your book, Ron. I'm extremely excited about the fact that you have accomplished this goal, which is something I know you have been talking about for a long time. As a parent of 2 black male children, I call it the Teray streak and the Jayla streak, because it is a challenge to raise black men, because we are black men. They are black men in this society. And I can count on my hand and feet all of my girlfriends and their husbands who struggle with raising black males in this society because they don't love them. Society does not love them. And I taught my sons that you are loved, this is where you are loved. And once you step out of this environment, people will not love you. We have taught our sons to obey the police officers. Do what they tell you to do. Ask them, may I call my parents? Obey them. Do not move. But that just didn't stop with them. That started with me, because I'm a very argumentative and opinionated woman, and I have said a lot of things to police officers that I probably should not have said. And then my husband had to remind me that you can go to jail, young lady. And so I must say to us as adults that we have to be mindful that they will take us to jail too. Yes, they will. So thank you, Ron, for coming out. I thank you, everyone, for coming out and supporting him. Please buy his book this afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Tadasha, thanks for the opportunity to be here. And Ron, thanks for sharing your experiences and thoughts. So I'm Jason. I'm from the Caribbean. I'm from St. Lucia. And I have an 11-year-old son. And over the last couple of weeks, you mentioned Botham Jean. I worked with Botham's mom when I worked with the government of St. Lucia for a number of years. I know her personally. We are friends. So the whole Botham Jean experience is being played out at my house, every day, because, we're watching all the latest news that comes out of Dallas. And if my son was not already terrified by the cops, you can imagine how he feels now. We have not had the talk yet. We kind of touch on it a little bit. But I am an architect by training. And one of the things that we do when you go to architecture school is there's a heavy social component to the program. You go into communities that you intend to change, okay? That's your training. You cannot intervene or change a built environment if you don't understand it. You have to know it. My question is, with training of police officers, what sort of training do they get knowing that they're going into communities where they're interacting with a diverse, population, and whether or not, if they get that training, how does that training now continue when they become police officers?
One of the things that doesn't happen with police is they don't get enough training. They really don't. They get training primarily in how to be a cop or how to deal with certain situations. They've got what they call a use of force continuum. The use of force continuum, I'll just break it down real quick, is you show up and you look. You have to have presence. You're there and you ask, what seems to probably be the problem here? And the next continuum is you get, like I said, you give verbal commands. And the next continuum is you put your hands on someone. You may have to put your hand on them to move them around. The next part of the continuum, if they resist, is to, as I say, it's the stuff that doesn't look good on video. Next thing you know, somebody's getting beat down. And the next continuum is somebody's getting shot. That's the continuum. There is no de-escalation training. How do I talk this person down without putting my hands on them? Because I'm told to automatically assume control, automatically be in charge. Some police departments are finally starting to do that. You talked about cultural training. There's almost none of that goes on. And I tell people that would be true if, and my good friends here from LA, you remember East LA. If you had plopped Ron Harris down in East LA, he would have thought everybody was a criminal and everybody was a junkie and this guy's a gang member, because I don't know East LA. They're just people hanging out in the hood. They're not doing anything. Black men are 3 times more likely to get shot by police than anybody else. Mentally ill people, 16 times. Because what happens in America today is when you dial 911, if Jupiter Dasha dialed 911 and say, our good friend Ron here is having a psychotic episode, we know him, we're just trying to get an ambulance here to get him to the hospital. They dial 911, that's the number to dial. They're not gonna send an ambulance. They're gonna send 2 guys in blue uniforms with guns on their hips.
You were the first person in the country to write a story to say that the war on drugs is a war on black people. And I'm wondering now, a century later, in writing this book, is that still the case? And has your views from what you wrote then changed any in having done this?
Well, and you're right. That was true. The war on drugs was horrific. The war on drugs was a war on black people. What's happening now is really interesting to me. And I talked to one guy working for a pharmaceutical company. He's a black guy. He said, we got $100 million fine, but that's a drop in the bucket to all the money that we're making. And I don't know if that's the reason, but we seem to not have been as aggressive on this particular drug epidemic. And this is by far, when people thought the crack thing was bad, this is way worse, way worse. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. There's still plenty of food left, and Ron has his books for sale. So enjoy the rest of the evening. And again, thank you.